Welcome to my session on hardening hybrid identity in the real world. My name is Sander Berkouwer and I'm the CTO at SCCT in the Netherlands. And I want to talk about something that I noticed at Microsoft in recent years, and that is that as a capitalist organization, Microsoft is truly trailblazing. If you notice that nobody within Microsoft would have predicted how hugely successful Windows 95 was, and that, well, actually its security wasn't on par, then yeah, you might forgive them. And although we all hated Windows Vista, it was closed by default, just like Linux is, and it introduced user account control. But yeah, sure, we all love Windows 7 today, but it was Windows Vista that introduced all the security features. And the same is true with Azure AD. It is open by default, but in recent years we're seeing that that Microsoft is closing it, and it's due by adoption. There's over 20 million organizations using Azure Active Directory and in the moment, and of course those huge numbers of adoption justify investments in the product and investments in security. And that is what is happening at Microsoft. And what we're seeing is a sliding slope where features are turned off because they are adopted enough and security features replace them. And of course, we're talking about hybrid identity. And hybrid identity today is the powerful combination of Active Directory on-prem, those sturdy domain controllers that you still run, and Azure Active Directory, the service. And as you use Azure AD Connect or your third-party synchronization solution, you get benefits of one Active Directory because that's what Microsoft had in mind. And you get single sign-on both on-premises with your clunky old protocols like Kerberos and NGLM, and of course those funky new federated protocols like SAML and OpenID Connect and SCIM. And it all works seamlessly because you now have one Active Directory. And of course there's all kinds of artificial intelligence based security enhancement because you can have monitoring and you can have identity protection and stuff like that. And it truly allows organizations to work anywhere, any place, anytime. So yeah, it's not really a surprise that Azure Active Directory was adopted in the last couple of months by many organizations more. And when we're talking about hardening hybrid identity, it is not about one Active Directory, it's actually about two Active Directories, because we have to harden the Active Directory on-prem, and that is specific. But of course, we also have to harden Azure AD, the service that we functionally have to manage as admins. And what I will try and explain is that there's about 8 main areas that you can actually invest in to up your information security level for your hybrid identity, up the security level of your on-premises Active Directory, but also the Azure Active Directory as a service. So let's start with hardening Active Directory. And what Microsoft really recommends, and this is something that came from the MVPs, is the tiered administration model. And what it allows admins to do is to have a segregation in terms of functionality from systems, so that if Active Directory is popped, if a lone workstation is popped, it doesn't affect your domain controllers immediately. It doesn't mean that once a lone workstation is popped, you can laterally move as an attacker to your domain controllers, because what you do in this case is you would just designate 3 tiers, and your domain controllers and your ADFS servers and your Azure AD Connect servers are in tier 0, and then there's all the other servers, and then there's your devices in tier 2. And of course, what you'd say is that your domain admins use an admin workstation and your server admins use different admin workstations. And these privileged access workstations, these PAWs, are either in tier 0 or in tier 1. And of course, your device admins have an admin workstation that is just like every other workstation in tier 2. And now, if we just use these admin workstations and disallow these workstations from going to a lower tier, so the privileged access workstation of a domain admin can only be used to access those domain controllers and ADFS servers and Azure AD Connect servers, but not all the other servers. Those are the responsibility of these server admins. And of course, server admins have nothing to do with devices because we have device admins for that. And if we do that, then all of a sudden we know that you can't laterally move as a server admin or a domain admin to a lone workstation that could be popped. And of course, if a server admin or a domain admin, if a server admin or a device admin actually tries to elevate to another tier, then that is something that we monitor and something that we report on, because that should not have to happen. That is something that could be an example of a breach. So this tiered administration model, it's hard to implement, but if you get around to it, and if you actually, and Microsoft will help you with that, if you are a premier customer, if you get around to that, then it really significantly increases the information security level of your Active Directory administration. Now there's other things you can do as well, and if we look at the Excel sheet that Microsoft shared for unnecessary services and tasks, then this is something that you could very easily do on Windows Server 2016 and Windows Server 2019. You can start with deploying your domain controllers, your ADFS servers, as server core installations. Unfortunately, Azure AD Connect can only be installed on a full installation, but having those domain controllers and those ADFS servers as server core installations really hardens them. There's no significant graphical user interface that can be exploited. There's no Internet Explorer. There's no stuff like that. And as you harden them, you'll see that on server core, you only have to disable 6 services that you won't ever need on domain controllers or ADFS servers. While on the full installation, you have to actually, and that's a recommended practice from Microsoft for the system, disable 40 services and even 2 Xbox related tasks that you have no purpose for on your domain controllers and ADFS servers. And of course not on your Azure AD Connect servers as well. Now of course you want to disable the legacy encryption and legacy protocols like triple DES and stuff like that. On your domain controllers you definitely want to disable SMB1 if you haven't already. And of course disable TLS 1.0, TLS 1.1 and SSL3 on all servers. So Microsoft doesn't even listen on these protocols anymore. You have to use TLS 1.2, or if you're funky with preview versions of Windows Server vNext and Windows 10 vNext, then you could use TLS 1.3 already. And hardening Windows Server like this lowers the attack surface. And many of the Windows updates that we see monthly at the Patch Tuesdays actually are for services that are in that 40 services box for full installations. So it really minimizes the risk. But of course, it's really hard to do retroactively. So we always tend to harden the Windows servers before we put them in production. There's Azure AD Connect Health. This is a service from Microsoft that you can use too. And it sounds pretty counterproductive to allow your domain controllers and your ADFS servers and your Azure AD Connect server to provide telemetry data to Microsoft and other diagnostic settings. But if you do it for your Azure AD Connect and it's on by default, and for your domain controllers and your ADFS servers and web app proxies, then what you'll see is that Microsoft will actually notify you when, or well, actually before replication issues in your Active Directory crash your environment, or before even your user notice that they can't log on anymore, because Azure AD Connect will actually perform some synthetic authentications from your web servers to your ADFS servers. And there's no need to worry about that internet access, and I know some companies do, but you can have Azure AD Connect through a proxy. Of course, Azure AD Connect requires Azure AD Premium licenses. It's 1 license per Azure AD Connect installation and 25 licenses in your tenant. They don't have to be assigned, but you can assign them. 25 licenses per domain controller, per ADFS server, and per web app proxy. So for larger organizations, this is actually a no-brainer to implement. And the other thing that I feel you'd really want to do is ban bad passwords. And as you have Azure AD Premium licenses, this is also functionality that you can use to prevent your users from using the top 1,000 leaked passwords or passwords that contain banned words that you specify. And this is important because as you specify certain words, then you'll notice that the passwords are really getting non-guessable. If you're a Ford dealership and you include all Ford models that exceed the 4-character limit, then those passwords of your salespersons won't include those model names anymore and therefore won't be easily guessable. This is all integrated into plumbing in Active Directory that has been there since the beginning because it uses passfill.dll. And that means that these bad passwords banning processes only apply for users that have the password must meet complexity requirements set to their accounts, for instance, through a fine-grained password policy. And of course, the solution must be installed on all domain controllers to be effective, because if there's one domain controller that has the default passfill.dll and doesn't ban the top 1,000 leaked passwords or the other banned words, then you can change your password on that domain controller and still circumvent all the security that we try to put in place. And a typical deployment would consist of a password protection agent on each Active Directory domain controller and a proxy component that actually communicates to Microsoft and gets all that information, and then allows domain controllers to pick up all that information over HTTPS again, and therefore have the same access to internet as you would expect for domain controllers. You want that through proxies or through proxy agents kind of solutions. And of course, the ideal place to put the password protection proxy is on a server that hosts Azure AD Connect, because most of the times we see that customers have the necessary traffic already allowed between domain controllers and Azure AD Connect installations, and between Azure AD Connect installations and the Microsoft Azure AD services. So that's 4 approaches that you can use to harden your Active Directory. Now let's look at hardening Azure Active Directory, because this is something that people look up to and don't really feel how to start. Well, starting hardening Azure Active Directory is actually quite easy, because Microsoft offers securescore.microsoft.com, and this secure score dashboard allows you to analyze your usage and your behavior and compare your configuration to baselines. It provides a history of configuration changes impacting that secure score. So if there's an admin that actually lowers your information security level, you can actually see that historically go down, and of course other admins in the team can then take action. And it provides true actionable insights on how to improve your information security. And let me show you in a short demo. So let me switch to my browser, and here's the Microsoft Secure dashboard. And this is actually a pretty good Azure AD tenants, because the secure score is already higher than the default, that is about 25%. these days, and this is largely due because all the admins already require multi-factor authentication. But let's look at the improvement actions anyway and see what's there. And Microsoft recommends us to enable a policy to block legacy authentication. Turn on a user risk policy and sign-in risk policy because this tenant is equipped with E5 licenses. And of course, ensure all users can complete multi-factor authentication registration. Then there's the customer logbox and all that stuff. And this list of improvement actions actually includes the percentage of the secure score that you would win if you follow that improvement action, if you follow that recommendation. And it also will tell you if there's actions that you already have achieved fully. So if you look at action number 8, you can see that require MFA for administrative rules is 10 out of 10 points achieved. So there's nothing much that we could actually do to improve that. And we've got the full 17.24% for that already. Now let's look at that enable policy to block legacy authentication. And what you see is that Microsoft provides you a step-by-step to implement that. It will give you some information so you can communicate to your manager on why you want to do that. And if there's a solution that you have in place that actually does this already, then you can also say, you know what, I don't want to see this recommendation ever again. So let's say we've resolved it through a third party. And that's all the options that you have on the left side of this as well. Now let's minimize my browser again and let's continue with the slides, because the secure score will actually help you get to a state where you have a higher information security, but of course it doesn't see everything. Microsoft is busy working on improving all that, but it's not there yet. There's still lots and lots more configuration items that are in that hybrid setup that Microsoft can't see or doesn't know how to properly analyze for all scenarios yet. So there's also some other steps that we can do. And one of the things is we can secure privileged access. So it's kind of a two-sided sword, because we need admins, but we don't really want them. And if we do need to have them, then Microsoft has a couple of recommendations that we could follow. So the first recommendation, and this is the most important one, is a recommendation of segregation of duties. You want to split day-to-day accounts and privileged accounts. And you don't want to know the amount of organizations that I meet on a monthly basis that have not got this yet. They are still struggling to get that split between these accounts. And of course, there's a couple of accounts with really high licensing cost, especially in the Dynamics 365 area, but it still pays off to split the day-to-day accounts and privileged accounts, because day-to-day accounts are susceptible to all kinds of threats because they have email and internet as part of their productivity suite, whereas privileged accounts should never have access to email or internet because they really don't need that. And of course, what you'll see is that the information security level for privileged accounts is much higher because you don't have that risk exposure. Microsoft recommends you to have between 2 and 5 global admins, regardless of your size. Don't stick with just one global admin, because if you lose that password, or if you lose the phone, or if you lose the multi-factor authentication method, you lose access to the tenant. And of course, if you need more admins, please delegate access to delegated admins with built-in or custom roles as you need. So a SharePoint admin or an Exchange Online admin or a user admin or a help desk admin can easily perform most of the roles that a global admin would perform on a daily basis. And as a global admin, of course, a true admin is a lazy admin. So yes, delegate as much as you can. Microsoft recommends you to have 2 emergency access accounts, and one of these accounts should not have a multi-factor authentication requirement, so you can actually access your tenant at the moment that the multi-factor authentication service is down. But you should really monitor their use. These should not be used as day-to-day admin accounts by your admins. These accounts should only be used in emergency scenarios. And of course, Microsoft recommends you to require multi-factor authentication for every privileged sign-in through conditional access, except for that one emergency access account. I get a lot of questions about Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, or PIM for short. But PIM, although I really love the solution, PIM really enhances these 5 recommendations. But without these 5 recommendations, PIM really doesn't add that much value in terms of information security. And all the 5 recommendations that you see here can be achieved with just Azure AD Premium P1 or Microsoft 365 E3, whereas PIM, of course, is an Azure AD Premium P2 or an EMS E5 or Microsoft 365 license required. So it's a really steep cost to get to privileged identity management. And in my opinion, if you have the 5 recommendations already in place, you have lowered your risk of admin account takeover so dramatically already that you might not even get much added value from privileged identity management, unless, of course, you need the additional approval processes and stuff like that. And for everybody who's not an admin, we should actually strip them from any privileged access to limit exposure to data leaks, because every access that a user has where he or she can see data that he or she is not supposed to see for their productivity needs, you should strip that, because if that account is compromised, then the attacker can see all that information too, and that might be a data leak in terms of the CPAA or the GDPR. And my recommendation is to change at least 4 settings. So it's the users can register applications, because there's also some malware applications that people can add to their Azure AD account. And you really want to be in control as an admin. It's the same with consent to apps. There's also some malware apps that pretend to be a good app and then try to take over your mailbox and stuff like that. The guests can invite setting is something that I really recommend to disable. And of course, restrict access to the Azure AD Administrator portal for everyone who is not an admin. And these settings come straight from the Security Information Center, the CIS Microsoft Azure Foundation Security Benchmark. So let me quickly show you how you do that. Let me switch back to my browser, and I've switched to a second tab right here. This is the Azure Active Directory Administrator Center. So let's click on Azure Active Directory in the left pane. Let's go, let's scroll down a bit to user settings. Here we are. And users can register application is actually the first setting that we want to disable. And restrict access to Azure AD Administration Portal is right here as well. So let's click that on yes, and let's save these settings. Then let's scroll down a bit and click on the Manage External Collaboration settings, because this is where all the guest settings are. And what you'll notice is the first 3 items already limit the access to properties and memberships to guest users, so that's good. That's the configuration that we want. But we can also disable the guest can invite settings, so set it to no and then save it. And for the last setting, for consent, we actually have to go back to root and then to enterprise applications. And there's a different user settings here as well. And we say that users can consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. We set it to no. And if you have any group owners in your tenant, you also want to disable the second option to no as well. And this is all explained to you in those information boxes that popped up as I changed the value to no. So let's save these settings as well, and let's close the browser. That was the demo for today. Perfect. As a last recommendation, I really recommend you to audit your tenant. By default, you only have 30-day retention of your Azure AD sign-in and auditing logs. And if you look at all the regulatory compliance needs that organizations have, then 30 days is absolutely nothing, because most organizations need them for 2 years or for 3 years. So for retention, you can stream them to an Azure Log Analytics workspace. And for organizations with 300 users or lower than that number, most of the times the Azure Log Analytics workspace will be free to use, even with a 2-year retention. But of course, the data is still in Azure, so it's not on-prem. And if you want to have your sign-in logs and your auditing logs on-prem, you can pick up these sign-in logs and auditing logs through the Microsoft API. And then you can correlate them in your own security incident and event monitoring, your own SIEM solution with the ADFS sign-ins, for instance, or the AD sign-ins or malware incidents, stuff like that. And of course, the SIEM solution is owned by the organization's operations center, your security operations center, and this is all away from Azure Active Directory, where all these sign-ins happen. So you actually segregate the location as well and the ownership as well, which is what most organizations that have a SIEM solution actually look for these days. As this presentation is only a 30-minute presentation, let's go to a conclusion. And as a key takeaways, I really hope that Microsoft settings, that you see that Microsoft settings don't represent your ideal balance for your organization between productivity, privacy, and information security. If there's features that you don't use, just disable them. If you don't use guest access, disable it. If you don't use the store, disable that kind of stuff. And over the years, many settings have had their defaults changed, but even new Azure AD tenants aren't secure by default. And of course, effective Azure Active Directory security starts in the on-premises Active Directory environment. And there's not a lot of use to truly harden your Azure Active Directory to allow only the pieces of productivity that your organization needs. If your Active Directory is just some open system connected to the internet on all the ports that you need to communicate to those domain controllers. That really makes no sense. Harden your Active Directory as well as your Active Directory to truly harden your hybrid identity. And with that, I would like to say thank you and have a good conference. Goodbye.